The sound of gunshots echoes down a polished hallway. Part of the body was injured. Where is he shot? In the arm, upper part of his arm. The man winces, clutching his left arm as blood splashes against the white walls. People scream. Phones drop. A normal workday turns into chaos. When you walk into a trading firm on a quiet Thursday afternoon, you expect flickering numbers, the faint hum of air conditioning, and the rhythm of profit and loss. But that day, the sound of typing was replaced by gunfire, and the man pulling the trigger wasn't a stranger. He was one of them. Hours earlier, he had brutally murdered his own family in their sleep, and now, he had returned to finish what he started. Before we dive deeper into this disturbing case, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you're into true crime stories that dig deep into the psychology behind every crime, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The scene that greeted officers that afternoon looked like something torn out of a nightmare. Blood trailed across the hallway floor, leading into the management office, where a pool of red glistened beneath a fallen chair. The shooter's name? Mark Orrin Barton. A man who once studied chemistry, dreamed of success, and later turned into a day trader, chasing fortune one stock at a time. But on July 29, 1999, that dream curdled into one of the darkest mass killings in American corporate history. Only hours earlier, Barton had bludgeoned his wife Leanne and their two children, Matthew and Michelle, inside their suburban Georgia home. He left behind chilling handwritten notes beside each body, explanations written in calm, deliberate words. He claimed he did it to save them from the financial ruin he believed was coming. Detectives who later read those letters would describe them as some of the coldest words ever put to paper, not from a man in rage, but from one who believed he was performing a twisted act of mercy. Mark Orrin Barton was born on April 2, 1955, in Stockbridge, Georgia, to Truman and Gladys Barton. His father's career in the U.S. Air Force meant a childhood spent moving from base to base, including several years in Germany. He grew up shy, quiet, intelligent, but emotionally distant. Teachers described him as gifted, especially in mathematics and science, but neighbors noticed something off. Behind the academic talent was a boy raised in strict discipline, with very little affection. Reports later revealed emotional and possible physical abuse at home. And when teenage rebellion met trauma, Mark turned to hallucinogens, LSD, and other dangerous drugs. He overdosed more than once, ending up in hospitals with hallucinations so vivid they left doctors alarmed. But somehow, he always managed to pull himself together long enough to continue. By the early 1980s, he graduated from the University of South Carolina with a degree in chemistry, a symbol of stability that didn't last long. Mark married Deborah Spivey, a woman described as kind, loyal, and steady, everything he seemed to need. Together, they had 2 children and built a home. But on September 8, 1993, during a family camping trip at Weiss Lake, Alabama, tragedy struck. Deborah and her mother, Eloise Spivey, were found brutally beaten to death at their campsite. The weapon was never clearly identified, and although investigators suspected Mark from the beginning, the evidence was too thin to charge him. He left Alabama a free man, but under a shadow of suspicion, and with a large life insurance payout from Deborah's policy. It was the first sign of the darkness hiding behind his calm face. 2 years later, Barton married again, this time to Leanne Vanderver, a woman 10 years younger. From the outside, it looked like he'd rebuilt his life. They moved into a quiet neighborhood in Stockbridge, Georgia, and had 2 children, Matthew and Michelle. Neighbors described them as the picture of suburban happiness, cookouts, birthday parties, and a polite man who kept to himself. But behind closed doors, the same cracks began to show. Mark had discovered day trading, the high-stakes world of buying and selling stocks for profit within a single day. He became obsessed, spending hours staring at screens, tracking charts, and calculating numbers. At first, he won big. Then, the losses began. Between May and July of 1999, he lost nearly $105,000 in reckless trades. When his trading account was finally frozen, Barton's financial ruin collided with his fragile ego, and that was the final spark. In the early hours of July 27th, as his family slept, Mark Barton made his final decision. He retrieved a hammer, walked into the bedroom closet where Leanne lay, and struck her repeatedly in the head. She never woke up. He then turned to his children, Matthew, 11, and Michelle, 8, killing them with the same weapon and positioning their bodies face down in the bathroom. Investigators believe he did it deliberately, to make sure they drowned in their own blood. The letters he left behind were chillingly rational, claiming that he had saved them from future suffering and financial shame. They were written with precision, no smudges, no signs of panic. For 2 days, Mark stayed inside the house, sleeping, eating, and watching TV in the same rooms where his family's bodies lay. Then, on the morning of July 29th, he showered, dressed in business casual, and drove to Momentum Securities in Atlanta. He walked in calmly and opened fire. Within minutes, 9 people were dead. By the time police arrived, Barton had vanished, triggering one of the largest manhunts in Georgia's history. When officers finally found him hours later, Barton was sitting in his car, gun in hand. Before they could approach, he pulled the trigger one last time, ending the manhunt with his own death. In the car, they found his final note. It read, "I have killed those closest to me because I cannot stand to leave them in a world where I have failed them." Even now, decades later, one question remains. How does a man who once seemed so normal, so intelligent, so average, turn into a monster capable of such cold destruction? He believed his downfall wasn't his fault. In his mind, the market was rigged, a conspiracy by unseen market makers, out to ruin him. Not the result of his own greed or reckless trades. Around 2 that afternoon, Mark Orrin Barton walked calmly into Momentum Securities carrying a Glock 17 and a Colt .45, both hidden beneath his shirt. The workers who saw him thought nothing was wrong. He smiled, even joked lightly, the same man who once shared coffee and trading tips. But behind that polite smile was a storm about to break. Security footage later showed him exchanging brief words with a trader, then walking quietly toward a private office. Moments later, gunfire erupted. 4 men, Kevin Dial, 38, Edward Quinn, 58, Russell Brown, 42, and Scott Webb, 30, were executed one by one. There were no warnings, no demands, just cold precision. Each shot fired like punctuation marks on his twisted vengeance letter to the world. Then silence. For a brief second, the hum of computers filled the room again, before the screaming began. But Barton wasn't finished. Within minutes, he drove to another trading firm nearby, Alltech Investment Group, where his rage deepened into method. He asked to speak privately with the managers, pretending to discuss business. When the doors shut, the real purpose revealed itself. He drew both weapons and began shooting with terrifying calm. Brent Doonan and Scott Manspeaker, who had trusted him, were among his first targets. Others never stood a chance. Alan Charles Tenbaum, Dean Diawala, Joseph J. Destert, Jamshed Havash, and Vadawati Muradara were all killed almost instantly. Most didn't even have time to realize what was happening. An administrative assistant, Kathy Van Camp, was shot multiple times and permanently lost her sight. Survivors hid under desks, crawled toward doors slick with blood, or played dead as Barton reloaded and kept firing. By the time he walked out, 9 people were dead and 13 more were wounded. Atlanta, a city known for its business polish and suburban calm, was suddenly drowning in sirens. "Quick! Quick! We've got an emergency! There's a lady down! Send an ambulance!" Police scanners lit up with chaos. "We've got multiple shooting victims at 3405 Piedmont Road, suspect identified as Mark Barton." It was July 29, 1999, A Thursday afternoon that would go down in American criminal history. The sun beat down on a city paralyzed by fear. Within an hour, every local law enforcement unit had Barton's face. A manhunt was underway. But the ending no one wanted came fast. Psychologists later performed what they called a psychological autopsy on Barton, a deep dive into his mind. What they found was chillingly textbook. Barton fit the mold of what experts call a family annihilator, men who kill their loved ones first, then seek revenge or recognition through wider violence. They share a pattern: narcissistic injury, a deep fear of failure, humiliation, or loss of control. When life begins to collapse, they turn violent rather than accept weakness. And Barton had a history. His first wife and mother-in-law's mysterious deaths at Weiss Lake years earlier were never solved, but investigators always suspected him. In essence, Barton's violence wasn't born overnight. It was a cycle repeating itself. Once money became his god and failure his hell, destruction became his language. The victims of July 29th weren't symbols or statistics. They were parents, immigrants, dreamers, people who believed in the American system that Barton convinced himself had betrayed him. He didn't just shoot coworkers, he tried to destroy the image of success he'd failed to achieve. Hours later, around 8 p.m., a quiet gas station in Ackworth, Georgia became the final stage. A green minivan pulled up to pump number 3. The cashier later said the driver looked tired, like someone who'd been driving all day. He was. Barton had been circling Atlanta for hours, chased by helicopters and police barricades. His van was packed with cash, extra ammo, and a full tank, proof that he planned to stay on the run. As officers closed in, Barton looked up once at the flashing lights, and ended it. One final shot. A single gunshot echoed through the humid air, and just like that, one of America's worst workplace massacres was over. 12 lives gone. One by suicide. Dozens of families broken. What police found in his van was equally haunting. Stacks of handwritten notes, cleanly written, businesslike, even polite. They read like confession and manifesto mixed in one. Barton blamed market manipulation, corrupt firms, and forces unseen. Not once did he admit fault. In his mind, killing his family was mercy, saving them from shame. Killing the traitors was justice, punishing those he blamed. His words were devoid of emotion, like the minutes of a company meeting. It was the banality of evil, horror written in perfect penmanship. When the truth unfolded, the world reacted in disbelief. News stations flooded Atlanta. Some people blamed the financial system, how unregulated, high-risk day trading preyed on unstable minds. Others saw it as pure narcissism and moral rot, a man so entitled that he'd rather erase his family than face embarrassment. Even experts debated. Some called him psychotic, detached from reality. Others said he was calculating, fully aware of right and wrong but stripped of empathy. But one thing united everyone: the terror of how normal he had seemed. Neighbors called him polite. Friends described him as intelligent. A man who smiled at barbecues, who waved at kids. That's the part that always chills people most, the realization that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear khakis and a clean shirt and drive a family minivan. In the months after the massacre, the U.S. Senate launched a rare investigation into day trading culture. Their final report, Day Trading, Case Studies and Conclusions, used Barton as a warning. They found that up to 90% of day traders lose money, many becoming addicted to the dopamine rush of risk. Firms often lured people with false promises of wealth, pushing them to borrow and gamble away everything. Mark Barton wasn't just a murderer. He was also a reflection of how unchecked ambition and mental decline can fuse into something catastrophic. Years later, survivors and victims' families still struggle with the weight of it all. Some turn grief into advocacy, fighting for better workplace security and mental health checks in high-stress jobs. Others couldn't move on, haunted by unanswered questions, by the loss of justice denied when Barton took his own life. Today, more than 2 decades later, the Atlanta Day Trader massacre still stands as one of the darkest examples of workplace violence in U.S. history. It's a story that warns how fragile stability can be when pride, paranoia, and silence combine. Leanne, Matthew, Michelle, Edward, Kevin, Russell, Scott, Alan, Dean, Joseph, Jamshed, Vadawati. 12 names, not just victims, but a reminder that behind every statistic is a heartbeat that once was. Every time cases like this resurface, people ask the same thing: could it happen again? And the uneasy answer is yes. Because as long as people hide pain behind ambition, ignore warning signs, and mistake control for strength, there will always be another Mark Barton waiting to fall apart. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as haunting as I did, hit that like, subscribe, and bell. It helps more people hear these untold cases. Stay alert, stay kind, and remember, sometimes the scariest crimes don't begin with strangers. They begin with someone you thought you knew.